student and very helpful always. So, what to say? Since it is being recorded, I can't say too many things. But I think the best way I can say is that I used to look after all my IT-related needs. So, I think it's really wonderful to have him here. It's nice to see him grow as a researcher. So, nothing can give a greater satisfaction to a teacher than see his student grow as a serious scholar. And I think he's doing a lot of wonderful work. And also, the other thing about him is that he's equally good in multiple areas. In fact, recently, I hope if you haven't, please do display it once. He has recently edited a special issue of a very prestigious journal, and which has very well-known, prestigious names as contributors to that. So he's not, in that sense, confined himself to just one area. In fact, even this, I think, is not part of his research really.
It's part of the research, but it's not part of the PhD.
Yes, PhD. Okay. Yes, part of research. Yeah. So, but yes, but not part of his PhD. Okay, Ritwik. So, welcome back to the department. Okay.
So, thanks to Dr. RNC and to all of you. Of course, this is homecoming, and that's always very sweet. It's always great to be back here. This is the first time I'm actually speaking in the department itself in this capacity. So that's especially wonderful. So today we'll be talking about, does generative AI make art, right? And I'll just give you some kind of preface to this talk before getting into the substance. The idea here is to really get the world of art and the world of AI kind of talk to each other, right? So I'll be articulating a framework using the work of Danto, a major philosopher of art, on how we can categorize works as works of art, right? So I'll be using his Transfiguration theory of art to do that. And then I'll be applying that to the case of AI-generated artworks or supposed artworks, and then assess whether those can in fact be called art. And further, whether they can be called good art, great art, and so on and so forth, right? So the idea here, of course, is to use the conceptual repertoire of the philosopher, right? The fact that we can make fine-grained conceptual distinctions and to apply them to this kind of cutting-edge area to make sense of it, right? So the idea here is art is really kind of almost like an excuse to say some stuff about generative AI, but on the way, obviously, I'll also be saying stuff about philosophical aesthetics, right? So that's kind of the background to this. But the discussion here goes beyond philosophical aesthetics towards more general issues about the capacities of generative AI, right? So that's the kind of preface to this, right? So, does generative AI make art? So we are in the midst of something which some people are calling the AI spring, like the Arab Spring or something, right? And the idea of the AI spring is that there's this sudden profusion of really new and advanced technologies which have kind of pushed the frontiers of so-called artificial intelligence, right? So all of you, I'm sure, have had some experience thus far with things like ChatGPT, DALL-E, Midjourney, those kind of things, right? They're being discussed all over the place. I'm sure some of you have tried your hand at it, using prompts and so on and so forth. People have been trying to find ways of integrating that into the workflow as well. As teachers, we have a huge problem with students trying to use it in assignments, and that's a huge concern. And there's a lot of discussion here and in the US, other places, on what do we do about that? Do we go back to like paper-based exams? So on and so forth, right? So it's all over the place. Now, one of the areas where this has generated a lot of recent discussion is in the field of art, right? But before I get there, I want to kind of ask a question, right? Or put a question on the table, which is that, is this a new dawn for artificial intelligence? Or is this a cyclical phenomenon, which is that the latest bout of over-optimism about the capacities of AI? Because that's happened before. If you look at the history of philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and AI, you'll see that every 15 or 20 years, there's supposed to be like new breakthrough in AI. So way back in the 70s, you had people claiming in the pages of prestigious journals like Behavioral Brain Sciences, you have people claiming things like Roger Shank's AI lab at Yale has now finally created thinking machines. And that's in the 70s, right, and early 80s. So this also goes cyclical. So we suddenly have, it seems, perhaps, that's why we are looking at it, another turn of that wheel, so to speak, where we now have ChatGPT, we have OpenAI doing all kinds of interesting things, we have new technologies like transformers and generative adversarial networks or GANs, right? So obviously we have created new technologies, new ways of doing AI. Our computational capacities and power has greatly increased, right? So it can do things now which were very difficult earlier. Some of the feats it does is pretty cool, like translation, for example. So I teach this cognitive science class at Ashoka every summer at the India Fellowship, right? And one of my favorite examples about AI used to be that AI is still not good at language in the sense it can't do machine translation very well. But that's no longer true. I've tried it myself, and if you give it like text in say English and tell it to make it a Hindi text or something, it does a pretty incredible job. It's improved massively over just a few years back. So it's definitely like forward move, no doubt about that, right? So when we are assessing what it can do, we have to keep all these multifarious factors in mind. Very much like a topic of current discussion, right? So let's move to art. So this, some of you might have seen this artwork, right? So this is by an artist called Jason Allen, and it was produced by an AI tool, a generative tool called Midjourney. Midjourney. What Midjourney does, Midjourney is very well known, it's like Dolly, it's like very well known in this space. What Midjourney does is you feed it a text prompt. That's why it's a transformer tool, right? You feed it a text prompt and it generates images out of the text. Text. Okay. A sentence. You can say that, okay, make me a painting which has these properties, right? And it will try to make something which closely approximates the prompt that you have put it, right? So, why it's called a transformer is because you're changing modalities. You're going from the modality of text to images. So, this painting became famous because Jason Allen actually won an art prize for this. He submitted it to an art competition in Colorado in 2021. And
if you're going to use the nuances of this painting, then you place this.
Definitely, yeah. So what the painting really is this like it's very elaborately painted essentially. There's a lot of profusion of colors. There are 4 or 5 people standing in the frame, and there's like a huge kind of like it's like a huge like a window almost like a round thing which looks out into the horizon, and there are trees and also the interesting thing about the painting is massive amounts of detail. Essentially, that's the main thing about it. There's huge detail. So if you do that by hand, it's going to be a very exacting process. That's the painting, right? So, and of course, in question answer, if you want more about, we can discuss more about the painting. So the interesting thing about this work is that Jason Allen won a prize for this, and he won a prize against human artists. So there were 21 entries in that category at this Colorado art exhibition, and the judges selected this work. Now, as it happened, the judges didn't realize it is painted by an AI tool. Okay, so it's an interesting story. There was a massive controversy. One, he won the prize because he won against human artists. And people are like, this guy didn't really make all of that. He didn't actually sit with a brush or even with digital tools and use that huge amount of skill and patience and craft that is needed to actually make this. He fed it text prompts and it generated this image. Now, obviously, he worked on it in the sense that he kept changing the prompt, he refined it, he had to make choices such as, am I satisfied with that product, do I need to change it, do I need to put on some filters to it, etc., etc. So there's definitely his agencies involved, no doubt, in a pretty heavy way. His agency is implicated as the artist, right? He's doing something with it, but what he's not doing is picking up a paintbrush and actually painting it, or picking up even an iPad and actually painting it on the iPad, right? What he's doing is feeding text prompts and then refining based on that prompt. Okay? So there's massive controversy over this. Now the judges in this particular competition, they double down. They say even if we knew that he used an AI tool, we would still give it the prize. Because we think it's actually better than the human-generated art for this particular contest, in this particular camp. So the judges said, it doesn't matter that we didn't know. We'd still give it the prize. Right? But a lot of people disagreed with that. There was a huge back and forth. It became a social media phenomenon. A couple of years back, we were pattern. Right? And Jason Allen, by the way, he was not trying to be deceptive, just for the record. When he submitted this to the competition, he had clearly marked Jason Allen via 𝗵𝗀𝗽. It was clearly marked. The judges didn't know what 𝗵𝗀𝗽 is, so they didn't make the connection. But he was not trying to be deceptive. He's an artist. So he legitimately thought that this is a new way of doing art, a new way of playing with the tools and materials and making art. And he just wanted to push the envelope in that sense. He was not trying to be deceptive. So this became a controversial issue. Another interesting case was this one. So this is called 𝗵𝗲𝗿𝗵𝗍, and it's by an art collective in Paris called 𝗵𝗲𝗃𝗍. Shadishka, what this shows is a man painted in an impressionistic style. So kind of smudgy style of painting, right? With again a lot of detail. So it's like a painting of somebody who would have painted that, right? It's that style. So, but this is not painted by a human being. This is not even painted by this art collective called 𝗵𝗲𝗃 collectively. They made this using stable diffusion, another AI tool, which is especially good at diffused painting styles like impressionistic painting, right? And this was in 2018. And this was auctioned by Christie's for $432,000. The reserve price was around $5,000 to $7,000. And auctioned like multiple times that number. It was auctioned like the work of major artists. Right? Again, controversial. Some people think it is legitimate extension of art. You can do art using this. Some other people think that this is not art because no skill is involved. Or at least skill in a mechanical sense is not involved. Are those issues clear in you guys? Right? Obviously, stop me at any point if something is not clear.
Yeah,
So,
can I, is it possible to show the step-by-step procedures in which this 𝗵𝗀𝗽 is working?
Well, that's a very good question actually. So part of the problem with what is called deep learning mechanisms which are used by this kind of generative AI is that we don't know the form that the algorithm takes. What we do is we set the initial parameters. Like with the prompt or however you are giving the input, you can set initial parameters. But what it does after that is complex mathematics. And it does complex mathematics in a distributed computing mechanism, which means that there are billions of computers at work. So we don't really exactly know what is going on in that. There is certain opacity. What we do know, of course, is that like a broader sense of what the algorithm. So we know that, okay, what it does is it does a certain kind of pattern matching. So what it does, it trains on lots and lots of prior data. So it cannot make this stuff unless you have fed a lot of impressionistic paintings to it early in the training. That's what it's supposed to work, right? So it has seen, quote unquote, a lot of impressionistic artwork.
So there will be a difference between the programmer and the user of the program.
Lot of difference. Oh yeah, there's a lot of difference. And the interesting case here is that the programmers also don't have total opacity about what the algorithm does once it sets off. Sorry, they don't have total transparency about the algorithm. So that's just a new thing that's happened with deep learning mechanisms. But in a broader sense, we know it's pattern matching that's essentially happening. It's advanced stochastic processing that's happening.
So it is non-supervised learning and they make their own rules.
I mean, after you set the initial parameters, initial rules, there are subsequent rule selection that is done by the programmer. That's exactly right.
And
now,
questions of plagiarism do not arise.
There are huge questions of, in fact, there is a case now. We can discuss some of this in the Q&A. So the New York Times has actually taken OpenAI, the largest AI company currently, to court, saying that they are using all our data. So it's all human-generated data. Yes. They're using to generate this. So there are massive plagiarism worries, huge worries. So there are worries about plagiarism, there are worries about ethical concerns, there are worries about things like what are called deep fakes and lots. There are huge concerns of that sort. Yeah.
I want to ask just a clarification thing. Are these paintings online submitted or are they displayed as artists? Because if you go and paint the painting, there's a different texture to it.
Right.
How does the texture generate if the painting is submitted offline?
That's interesting. So actually the Jason Adams painting is actually printed. It was submitted on paper. He got it printed by a professional art shop. So it's printed like any other art that so a lot of people now, professional artists also work on iPads. There are very sophisticated tools, you can make whatever art you want on the iPad, and if they want to exhibit it somewhere, they go to a professional print shop and they print them on canvas. So this is how this was, like artists usually do. I mean, he's a professional artist, so he was following that protocol.
And I'm sure you can even use 3D printers or something.
They're not as advanced as to print this color, kind of. This
I'm saying just in case you want to give that
right.
show paint at different levels.
Right, so coming back to this. So, these cases occurred. The question of, is this art? Is this not art? What role does the skill of the artist play in categorizing something as art? And so on and so forth, right? And some of the controversy actually recalls prior events in the world of art. Very famous event was this one, which is called Duchamp's fountain. Some of you must be aware of this. Is pretty kind of, right? So Duchamp was a major artist, Marcel Duchamp, right? And there was an art fair in New York City in 1970, where they invited, far and wide, invited entries of new kinds of art. And what Duchamp did was to take his urinal, right, a literal urinal, and he put the name 𝗏𝗏 because he was very well known, so he had to submit this anonymously. He put the name R, or pseudonymously, put the name 𝗏𝗏 on it, and called it the fountain, and submitted it for this art fair, right? And the judges were outraged. They were like, he's making fun of us. This is not art. This doesn't have beauty and other things that we usually associate with art. It is not pleasant to look at. It doesn't elicit those kind of emotions, right? This is just an everyday industrially produced object, right? But Duchamp insisted that he was not doing it to cock a snook at the organizer or something. He was serious in presenting this as art. He thought that if you exhibit this and if you invite the artistic gaze of the people, they would see artistic qualities in this object. Very controversial, very famous case, Duchamp's fountain, right? And this is of course 1970, and that period, which is like the early part or the first half of the 20th century, is very significant in the world of art, right? It is significant because at that point we have something called mechanical reproduction, right? Very famous essay by 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗵𝘁𝗄𝗶, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. What kind of mechanical reproduction does Benjamin have in mind in 1935? Photography, obviously. Photography has completely upended the art, right? Before you have photography, portrait painters could make a lot of money, right? Before you have easily available, cheaply available, widely available photography, if you want your likeness captured, how do you do that? First, you have to be very rich, right? And then you engage a portrait artist, and they paint you. That was the only way. But then you have the camera. You have this entirely new chemical process, which is photography. And photography makes it trivially simple to reproduce, to capture not just portraiture, but landscapes and all kinds of things, right? So Benjamin is asking, he was an important cultural critic, he's asking a question that what status does art have when it can be so easily and trivially mechanically reproduced? You know, you don't need to now hire expert painters to paint portraits or horizons or whatever, or landscapes. You can just photograph them. Benjamin was concerned about this, and he felt that this reduces the aura of the artwork. What you were saying, what's your name? But Sandra was just saying something about, she used the word texture. He had something similar in mind, but a little further, more cultural than just texture. Benjamin thought that if all you have is a reproduction, not an original artwork, then the aura of the work is lost. And there's something more. If you go to a museum and see an original painting by an important, by a great artist, it does have a certain physical presence or aura. That's actually true. I felt that, right? And go to the National Gallery of Modern Art if it's still operational, and go check it out, right? And you'll see that. Like, there's something about being in the presence of great art in a physical sense. And that's the kind of thing which Benjamin is talking about. Right? So he was concerned about this change with mechanical reproduction. How does this relate to AI? Because AI, of course, is the ultimate mechanical reproducer. Now we have something which has gone far beyond the cameras of the 1920s. Right? Of course, photography itself is now much easier. Everybody's doing selfies and all that. But also now we have transformer generative models where you can produce, so to speak, artwork without even picking up something like picking up paint or whatever, picking up a paintbrush. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is give it some commands and it generates something which looks like art. So it's the ultimate in mechanical reproduction, right? So that's why I'm talking about 𝗂 and I'm talking about Benjamin. Because the things that they are talking about, hang on, please just hold your question. The things that these people are talking about in the early 20th century are now once again very in focus. Because the world of art is massively changing, right? And it's kind of going forward in the same direction, which is that the skill of the artist, the craft of the artist, becomes less and less important, so to speak, in assessing whether something is an artwork. That's the big shift, right? So, of course, a famous example of that is Picasso. Picasso was a prodigy. He was enormously skilled. But when he makes 𝗏𝗏𝗏, this is not supposed to be about beauty. It's not about the traditional aesthetic categories. In fact, it's supposed to elicit a different set of emotions. Something about the horror of war. Right? It's supposed to put you in a reflective stance, quite further on from beauty, right? So if you see Picasso's work as a young teenager, he was 14 or 15, he could do charcoal drawings of people, basically make portraits, and those charcoal drawings used to look like photographs, basically, black and white photographs. He was very skilled, right? But Picasso is not famous for those charcoal drawings. He's not famous for that, because cameras took over, right? There wasn't any market anymore for really nice charcoal drawings. And there's some niche market obviously, but not as much as there was earlier. But there is a market for that. There's a market for a new kind of art which is called conceptual art. Right? Art which makes you think. Right? Art which is not about affording just aesthetic pleasure, but which is about affording reflection, thinking, contemplation. In other words, in the words of Arthur Danto, who we'll talk about very soon, art becomes like philosophy. That's what Danto said, right? Danto said that in some sense we have reached the end of the art world. But by that he was not being pessimistic. He was being optimistic in a sense. He felt art now emphasizes meaning, concepts, rather than just aesthetic pleasure. So I'll put something on the table which becomes more and more important as this talk goes on for our discussion. This is a distinction, which is a philosophical distinction, very important, between aesthetic qualities and artistic qualities. And that's a 20th century phenomenon. The distinction between aesthetic and artistic qualities. They could be related, but they're still conceptually different. Right? So something could be a work of art, and in fact an important work of art, without affording aesthetic pleasure. Like earlier. In fact, it's not meant to afford aesthetic. Right? So, you have Danto. And the theory is called the Transfiguration theory of art. Danto is a major figure, perhaps the major figure in the philosophy of art in the last 100 years or so. And he wrote this 1964 essay called The Art World, which is where this word, art world, becomes a famous word. And the follow-up 1981 book called The Transfiguration of the Commonplace. And Danto argued the following. This is the definition which is supposed to be necessary and sufficient. And he said that to be a work of art, an object must satisfy both the following conditions. One, it must be related in some way to the art world, which means to the history of art and to art-making practices. That's the first condition. And two, it should be about something. That is, it should have meaning, or what philosophers would call intentionality. Right? The artist's intention makes the work of art expressive. The work is about something. Right? Danto thinks these two things are jointly necessary and complementary to say something is a work of art. And as I was saying earlier, distinguishing the aesthetic and the artistic qualities. What he's talking about here is the artistic part, the artistic qualities. The aesthetic discussion of whether it's successful, whether it's good art, whether it's beautiful art, is a further discussion. That's a separate discussion altogether. So you could have something which is a work of art and that makes no sense, or not good art. Right? And what prompted this really was another very important event in the history of art, which is the rise of the avant-garde artist Andy Warhol. Right? Have you guys seen the Brillo boxes? Some of you. So, important event. This is 1964 when Danto wrote the essay after he visited this gallery. Right? So, Andy Warhol is this emerging avant-garde artist in New York City. And what Warhol does is that he paints these Brillo boxes. So, this is the exact facsimile reproduction of a commercial product. Brillo was a soap pad brand, right? They sold soap pads in these big cartons. And what Warhol did in this particular exhibition was to stack a bunch of these cartons together and say, that's all. Now, in this case, incidentally, there is a lot of skill involved because these are not the actual cartons you buy from the market. He actually created them manually himself. So he painted them all painstakingly to look exactly like those original cartons. So there is that skill involved. But the important thing is, and this was very important to Danto's theory, this is going back to Leibniz, where it's the identity of indiscernibles, right? That you cannot discern visually from the actual commercial product. So the question that arises is, what makes this a work of art? Rather than, and the commercial product that you get in the store shelves or whatever, is not art. That's the question, right? And that's interesting because obviously it cannot be, as Danto realized, it cannot be anything visual about that work because they're absolutely indiscernible from what you get in Walmart. Right? You can go to Walmart and buy this Brillo box, and that's not art. But Warhol has painted them and put them in the museum in Stable Gallery, New York City. That's art. Now, how does that happen? So when Danto wrote the Artward essay, some people took it to mean a kind of rather simple sociological point. They thought he's advancing something called the institutional theory, right? That things become art when artists and curators, people who are important in the world of art, say it's art. So Warhol is an artist, Clement, whatever, Green or whatever, was a important art critic. They are saying it's art. Oh, this must be art. And a lot of people thought that that's what Danto was saying. And they even were willing to accept it. This is the age of post-structuralism and all, right? So they're like, oh yeah, this makes sense. And Danto was simply shocked. They're like, this is not what I was, this is nonsense. I wasn't saying something is art, this is circular. I wasn't saying something is art just because an artist says it's art or something, that's ridiculous. So Danto was shocked that this is how the theory has been understood by people. That is why he took pains to write a series of essays. And finally this book called Transfiguration of Commonplace to actually clarify what he was onto. He wasn't onto some simple-minded sociological institutional problem. He thought that was circular and totally, on his terms, useless to understanding what art is. Right? So, just a preface there. Right? So, going back, he then clarified that it must have these properties. Something is not art just because an artist says it's art. It's art because it has expressive power. It's about something. But that's not sufficient, that's necessary. That's not sufficient by itself. Because philosophy, or literature, lots of things, literature of course is art, but philosophy or any kind of discursive dialogue, discursive text, also is expressive. But it's not artistic, or not necessarily artistic at least. Right? So you need something more. Then you need this other condition about being related to stuff that's going on in the art world. In other words, it's part of a dialogue with art that has gone before. It's not simple-minded sociological, oh, the architect said it's art, so it's art. That's not what he meant. But it's artistic in virtue, at least partly in virtue, of answering questions which artists have posed. Or a new take or interpretation of stuff which has happened before in the world. So there is this historical, Danto's Hegelian. So there is that historical dimension. but it's not a simple-minded institutional dimension to it. It's that it's artistic because the artist is consciously, in some sense, placing it in the world of art. It's trying to make some point about it, and that point, of course, is about the world largely, but also makes a point about the world of art. So it's interpretive and responsive to the artwork, right? So this is a nice quotation, it's interesting, which kind of shows the distinction between aesthetic and artistic qualities, very important. So never mind that the 𝗵𝗶𝗿𝗵𝗏 may not be good or much less great art. Obviously, you're not thinking it's like Picasso or something. The impressive thing is that it is art at all. That's what he was interested in. Because a philosopher, he's interested in these definitional questions of what makes it art, right? If it is, why not indiscernible? That's the lively speaker, right? Why not indiscernible 𝗵𝗏 boxes that are in the stock room, Walmart, right? Or has the whole distinction between art and reality broken down? That's what he's worried about in that essay, 1964, right? And he was fond of using this example, the red square. So, the Columbia University professor 𝗵𝗲 Agarwal, she's written a recent book just on this example. And that book runs in 150 pages. It's crazy. She's a student of Danto's. And she's written a book on the red square. So, what is this red square example? Danto develops this kind of philosophical thought experiment, which he develops in this book. Which is that you could have, and it actually goes back to 𝗁𝗏𝗃𝗏 and various other philosophers who have discussed similar things. So the story is supposed to actually go back to the Bible. So you have the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, right? And the question is, how will an artist depict this? Right? It's the Old Testament. How will an artist depict this? And 𝗁𝗏𝗃𝗏 writes somewhere that what an artist will do is just make a red square and say that the Israelites crossed the sea and those who couldn't cross are dead. That's it. A red square. Right? And 𝗁𝗏𝗃𝗏 also said another way that you can understand a red square could be just my mood. I'm upset, despondent. Right? So Danto took this and expanded it into a series of discussions on the various interpretive possibilities of something as simple as a red square. The red square could stand for revolution. It could stand for the red square in Moscow or Beijing. It could stand for bloodshed. It could stand for love. There are essentially infinite interpretive, expressive possibilities of this. So what makes it artistic is obviously not just the physical properties, because all these are absolutely identical. But if they are interpreted differently, or if they are meant to be interpreted, and that's two different things. One is response dependence. It's like I am a viewer, I look at a red square and I make whatever interpretation I want. And that's fine, of course. But something more happens with art, which is that the artist has some conscious intention of trying to make you think a certain way. And then that intention would guide how to present that work. So, 𝗵𝗲𝗿𝗁 took everyday objects like Campbell's soup cans, 𝗵𝗏 boxes, all kinds of such things, and presented them in a new way, in a new setting. Because just like Duchamp, 𝗵𝗲𝗿 was trying to invite the aesthetic or artistic gaze upon them. The idea was that in our everyday life, all these commercial objects, they have beauty, they have things which can afford us aesthetic pleasure and artistic contemplation. If we see them under that light, if we see them, in other words, Fregean terms, the right mode of presentation, we have to see them in a certain way. Obviously, 𝗁𝗏 didn't use words like mode of presentation, it's just, I'm going to explain that, right?
Is this installation art?
Sorry?
Is this installation art?
Which installation?
Installation art? The genre, we know there is a different genre of art and installation art where you...
Yeah, installation art kind of starts off, yeah, the book explodes afterwards, exactly, yeah, absolutely. And then there are all kinds of, so people like Caroline Schneemann do like body art through that. So the performer becomes part of the art exhibit. So, and this is not theatre, because she's static in some sense. So she's part of the art exhibit, and that's like late 60s feminist art in New York City, which is actually the kind of avant-garde movement. And this stuff is why Danto
we would like to know more about this.
We'll talk about it. It's actually very fascinating. 𝗫𝗏 was just incredible. But that's why Danto becomes very important as an art philosopher. Because he's theorizing this entirely new type of art that's coming up. Conceptual art, installations, those kind of things. And the traditional New York art critics were just shocked by these developments. Right? So when Warhol puts these Lido box, the traditional critics are, this is ridiculous. Just like the reaction to Duchamp. Possibly the reaction to AI art as well. That's the kind of link that I'm at least suggesting here. That every time there's a genuinely new development, there is naturally, and that I think okay, there's a kind of critical reaction, and also there could be some resistance to that newness, right? So Danto is giving us a theoretical apparatus to understand how this kind of stuff could be art at all. And that's important, it could be art at all. The subsequent question of whether it's successful art or, because that depends upon your larger theory. Like if you're a Marxist, for example, it is successful if it has certain political connotations, right? So whether the art is successful will depend upon other larger theoretical commitments, right? But Danto's idea is, and not just Danto, then others, art critics and philosophers of art in his way, the idea is, how do we define it as art at all? That's why I was emphasizing so much the distinction between artistic and aesthetic qualities, right? So we'll come back to some of these things. So there are some important conceptual distinctions. I'm just drawing out kind of the philosophy out of this, so that we can apply to the AI case, right? And these distinctions are the following: aesthetic or formal qualities versus artistic qualities. Danto is this interesting example of a young child, and we've all seen this obviously, can produce pleasing or even beautiful things, right? But in most situations, it wouldn't be art. It wouldn't be art because, unless the child is Mozart or something, in most situations, the child is not consciously responding to stuff that's happened in art. So they're not consciously placing it in some sense in the art world, right? Children can and often are very expressive, so you can meet that condition. Because children, when they're making art, often want it to be about something. So you can meet that condition fairly easily, I believe, actually. But the other condition of some responsiveness to what's happened in art, that is unlikely that a child, in most situations, will meet that. Right? So again, this distinction between things which might be very pleasant to look at, which might be joyful to look at, and so on and so forth, may not qualify as works of art. And on the other hand, you could have everyday objects which, placed in the right setting, inviting the right kind of gaze, could be transfigured, quote unquote, that's our theory, into works of art. So that's why Danto's first chapter in the book is called Works of Art and Mere Real Things. So he says, real things are mere real things. Cans are soup cans. And Warhol can transfigure it. In other words, elevate it to works of art. Notice the play that Danto is making here. It's a challenge to Plato. Right? Because for Plato, art is a copy of a copy. And Danto wants to put that upside down. So works of art and mere real things. Not that Danto was necessarily anti-Platonist. He was in fact an essentialist. That's why he's giving a definition of art and all of that.
He's the same Danto who believes in basic actions, right?
Yeah, so same. Very much so.
The basic action theory may be conflict with this. Anyway.
We can talk about that. That's interesting. I actually don't know much about his action theory, so we can actually talk about that. So yeah, but the same Danto, action theory and metaphysics, the same. Danto generally actually was kind of a Platonist. He thought it's very important to distinguish between appearances and reality. He thought that's a fundamental thing in philosophy. But on art, he thought Plato was an utter Philistine. And this idea of a work of art is a copy of a copy, he's attacking that in some sense by saying work of art and mere real things. Just kind of placing, and what I'm doing here is really placing what Danto is doing in the art world of philosophy, so to speak. Even the title of the chapter is responding to what's happened in the philosophy world, right? So work of art and mere real things. So the third distinction I want to talk about, the second we've already spoken about quite a bit, something is art is versus whether it's good or successful art. The third one gets relevant to our discussion about AI, right? So what we're doing, we're discussing all this art theory stuff to kind of take it back to AI, right? which is AI as artist versus AI as a tool that artists can employ to make art. There are two different discussions, right? And very often, you would see in the media and when people are talking about it on podcasts and so on and so forth, they don't make this distinction. And it is pretty confusing, frankly. Right? So when they're talking about how 𝗵𝗀𝗽𝗏 is making art, is 𝗵𝗀𝗽 making art? Is 𝗵𝗀𝗽 making art? It is doing some mechanical stuff. Right? That's why I spoke about 𝗵𝗵𝗿𝗵𝗿 mechanical reproduction. The camera does the mechanical stuff when you take a photograph. Is your camera making art? When I photograph something using this kind of very advanced camera, there's a lot of processing. Right? So when I say I want to take a photograph in portrait mode on this thing, it does a lot of selection on the lighting, on the focus, on blurring background stuff, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of selection, right? But if somebody takes a portrait photograph, you would usually congratulate the person who's making a very good photograph, who's taking the photograph, oh, that's a nice photo. You can say, yeah, the tool's very good. iPhone 15 is better than iPhone 14 or whatever. Of course it is because it has all these technical specs which are better, right? But it's a bit of a stretch to say, I guess. Although I'm putting it up for discussion for all of us, of course. But it's a bit of a stretch to say that it's the iPhone which does art, right? So there's a quite important distinction between when you're talking about AI as an artist versus AI as a tool that somebody like Jason Allen might be using to make art. Two different questions, right? So, a human like Jason prompting an AI tool like 𝗵𝗀𝗽𝗏 could, it seems to me, display significant agency in how they interact with the algorithm and its results, right? It appears there's no problem in a human using an AI tool meeting Danto's conditions for their work to count as a work of art. In other words, in relating what they create to the artwork and imbuing it with meaning by making it about something. These are the two conditions, right? So we are just applying the theory now, right? So if you want to now assess the question of whether Jason Allen makes that art, well, not everybody can give that prompt, right? It takes a certain skill to become so good at prompting. Some people are beginning to call that prompt engineering, right? It takes a certain skill to prompt things effectively enough to generate what you actually wanted to generate. That's not true. If you play with the ChatGPT and all kinds of things, unless you prompt it pretty well, it can get discouraging. So there's definitely some skill involved there. There's also agency involved in selecting what you want, how you interact with the algorithm, and so on and so forth, right? So it seems, if we take this 20th century discussion on art forward into the 21st, that the question of whether something counts as art is conceptually independent from the sheer aesthetic skill that the artist is displaying. Right? But that's still an important question to assessing whether it's good art. That's a separate question. But the prior question of whether it's art need not necessarily be a question of whether the artist has mechanical skill. And that's a really important development in the 20th century, right? Turning art into a conceptual thing. For example, suppose I want to make cartoons. Let us say I have things to say about politics or something. And I want to say them through the medium of cartoons, right? Now, I don't have enough skill to make particularly good cartoons. But what I could do now is I could use an AI tool to say, make me a cartoon which has these properties. And the more I feed into that, the more details I give, the more layered I am with the prompt, the more layered the output's going to be. That's clearly my artistic agency. It's doing what I want it to express. And if it does not express what I want, I can reject it. That's my agency as well. Right? So let us say I train ChatGPT or DALL-E or whatever on lots of political cartoons. Okay, so it's got trained on it. And then I say, make me a cartoon in the style of 𝗥𝗶𝗁𝗄 on some current issue. I specify the issue, I specify how many characters I want in that cartoon, I specify what I want them to wear, I specify what I want them to say, I specify how the speech bubbles should look, I can specify a lot of things, right? And let us suppose the tool makes that. Right? So what I'm not doing, I'm not mechanically drawing it. But it's still something I'm making in some sense. Just like when I photograph, I'm not doing the chemical work that the camera is doing. Or in this case now, the electronic work or the computational work. But it's still my scene composition. I've selected what I want to photograph. I've selected what I want to focus on and not focus on. The time I want to photograph, those are things I've selected, right? And those are all connected to my agency and what I want to say through it, what I want to preserve in a photograph, right? So it seems to me that if you think about it through all these distinctions in mind that I discussed, then you can say that using an AI tool could be a valid extension of art making practice. Just like artists use all kinds of tools. Right? And the quality and success of AI-generated works of art, which are produced through significant extent of human agency, that's what I was just describing, can be judged like other human-produced works of art. So the aesthetic appreciation or criticism can proceed as you do with other things. That's what the judges were saying in that Colorado art fair, right? Who gave Jason Allen that prize. Right? It doesn't matter that Midjourney makes it, we think it's pretty good. So it should still win against all those other people who made whatever other things are, right? This is one discussion on there being a human artist with agency, with things to say, with expressive power, obviously, and with some knowledge of the art world, and being able to thereby use the AI tool to produce something which meets the conditions which people like Danto laid out. It seems to me that it would be hard to resist in that scenario, that it's in fact a valid art-making practice, right? On the other hand, the much more, fantastical discussion of AI as an autonomous artist itself, I think there's a different answer to that particular question, right? So the question is, can generative AI tools like Midjourney or 𝗏𝗲 be considered artists themselves in virtue of the fact that they're producing these works, right? So this becomes a question of, I'm just translating one question to the other, what capacities are needed for an entity to be in a position to meet stuff like Danto's criteria? That is an example. There are various other art theories. There's 𝗁𝗲 theory, which is also meaning-based theory. So various theories, and they are not that dissimilar. You can substitute the Danto theory for other 𝗁𝗲 art theory and still run the same argument essentially, more or less. But Danto is just very old, and I think it's a kind of deep and sophisticated theory. So what capacities are needed for an entity to be in a position to meet Danto's criteria for making art? That's the question. And that's a transcendental question. It's a transcendental argument, right? Which is very common in cognitive science, so that's hardly a surprise. X is true only if Y is true. That's a transcendental argument. Right? Kant, most famously. So the world that we have is possible, the knowledge that we have is possible, only if certain antecedent conditions are. That's Kant, right? That's the first statement. The transcendental reduction of the categories. Right? So a lot of cognitive science, you're familiar, has a super Kantian flavor. So it's not super surprising for the transcendental argument which comes up here, right? So X only if Y. So in other words, here it would be an AI tool, or not tool, an AI entity is an artist, autonomous artist on its own, only if certain prior conditions are met. What are those prior conditions? Those prior conditions obviously have something to do with having consciousness, having intentionality or meaning-making ability, and having agency. Right? Because unless you have that, how do you imbue what you're doing with expressive power? How do you express something through it? Unless you yourself have a sense of meaning. Right? This brings us back to famous stuff on AI, like the Chinese way. Right? John Searle's famous thought experiment. That even if an AI tool behavioristically meets all the external conditions, so something like a Turing test, you still can't say that it has meaning. This is a kind of telescoped version, quick version of the Searle argument, right? That the idea that it has some meaning within itself is missing, no matter what the algorithmic sophistication or computational achievement might be. And it seems that the new generation of AI has left that question fundamentally untouched. There seems to me, and I read up on this literature a bit, you guys know stuff on this which could educate me and educate all of us, please do bring it up during discussion. It seems to me, and this is a little disappointing, there's so much discussion on the technical sophistication of AI, which is fantastic obviously. But a little on the philosophical stuff that's actually the important, I would say, the really deep stuff there, right? Which is, are we more advanced on what meaning AI might have compared to the other science models in the 80s? Seems like they're pretty much at the same place. We have much greater computational complexity, undoubtedly. We have much greater stochastic sophistication. We are doing a lot of, and that means that we are doing a lot of new things with AI. This cartoon example I just said that, I want to make political cartoons, I couldn't do that with like earlier models. I couldn't do that with this model. Right? That's amazing. Now, I did try to make these slides with AI as a kind of meta commentary. I thought that I'm going to tell you guys that these slides that you see were actually made by a transformer model, but unfortunately that didn't happen. So I gave it the prompt and everything and just produced a rubbish. Like something, okay, whatever, kind of superficial. So not fun, So then I had to do this painstaking thing, open Google Slides, find a theme, find all the images, type the text,
You should have kept that draft as well. Just to compare.
Yeah, it should be there, right? It's auto-save, so I'll probably find it. But the thing was, it was a bit more border than it was worth, is what I realized essentially. So it's not, unfortunately, it's not quite at the level of making effective slide text for philosophical editions. At least, at this point. But hopefully it'll get there. But even if it gets there, it produces that, and that would be amazing and helpful and all of that, we can't say it's exercising that X which is needed. Sorry, that Y that is needed to say it has autonomous agency. Or, in other words, autonomous art making. Right? So that's interesting. So this has the same flavor of this stuff coming over and over again in a cyclical way. That's called 𝗲𝗏 automaton. And that was made in 1800 in London. 1800. And what he did was this pretty interesting stuff. He was an inventor, a French inventor, he was working in London. And he created this machine which could be taken to galleries, exhibits, circus grounds, museums, all kinds of places, and it could draw right there. In this case, it's not generative because there were 7 hard-coded drawings it could make. It was already decided what it would do. So you could press a button or give it a command, give it a prompt, in other words, and it would make the drawing and it would make that sketch right in front of you. And if you go online and check out the sketches it makes, they are amazing, they are pretty cool. Very detailed sketches of birds and stuff like that. And it would do it right in front of you. So in this case, you actually see the moving of the pencil and so on and so on. And obviously not generative because it's hard code. Now we have generative machines. So they can do some selection, some curation, that kind of stuff. But there's something of, I think, the same flavor, right? That it's producing the stuff. But it's producing the stuff without meaning in some sense. We put meaning to it. We put meaning to it because they're computers that can put meaning to it, right? And that's an important, it's a kind of philosopher's point which is important for all of us to keep in mind and bring up to these discussions when they happen, right? So this is the final slide. We cannot quite hold that AI produces art, I think, till we have significant evidence and some explanatory basis for saying that current AI technologies possess consciousness, intentionality, and agency. The upshot is that we can evaluate AI-generated imagery on aesthetic and even artistic grounds. But that's not sufficient to say it produces art itself. It can and does, I think, assist in the production. Much like a camera assists in the production of drawing. So now I'm really happy to get your questions, breakbacks, and comments. Thank you.
curate. So I think there was something for everybody. Right? Electronics, or you are a relative minded, mind person, or somebody doing cognitive science. So there's a lot for everybody. So I will not start with my questions first, but maybe in between I'll raise.
That's a great sacrifice.
Yeah. So because something that immediately came to my mind when you were presenting Danto was that I felt that you took a weak example. Maybe I would say something like taking 𝗂𝗏𝗏 perhaps maybe.
In terms of theory?
Yeah.
Oh, there can be so many. That's very fascinating.
So that.
But the reason was that she's a little bit earlier than these 𝗵𝗲 development systems. So I want to kind of showcase those.
Yeah. So I'm just saying that was sort of the reason why her name came to my mind was when you presented your version, which is an improvement of on the conditions that Danto puts. So I think that way you would have fitted closer with her than using
Who's that?
She's a 𝗵𝗲𝗶𝗴𝗵 scholar. Yeah.
Okay, we call it 𝗵𝗲𝗶𝗵𝗵. We in fact, it's interesting you brings it up because when we were, so Quinn and I were getting our Suzanne Langer. So Deepa ma'am was a big fan. And in the aesthetics course that she taught here, Langer featured very prominently in that class.
I didn't have any relation with Deepa Langer.
I'm just
my own thinking with aesthetics. Navneet, one, then there's a girl there, then Nilanjan, there's one there. Actually, you've already had a few.
The others have answers, not just
That's a good one. Okay. Nilanjan? I don't know.
Somebody was there.
That compliment. Yeah. Nilanjan, Navneet first? Yes. Sorry.
Ravi, you should maybe write down the names in
No.
Well, we will remember all the names.
No, he's not name, I remember the faces. And that will allow, writing will sort of create compulsion. So I can always say that, okay, I saw this name first and later. Yeah, please, Navneet.
Okay, so as I am getting, you are boiling down to AI must have intentionality or consciousness, and then whatever product it is giving us, then we can say it is art.
Yeah, those are necessary conditions, not sufficient.
So in that way, you seem to be going with Sir. In the
On this question,
yes.
Yeah.
And just commenting that how to define cognitive science, and in that connection, can we say cognitive science is simply that machine which gives us intelligent behavior, or cognitive science is something which has to explain how consciousness, intentionality emerges in an animal-like consciousness or human consciousness. Animal. In the first case, it is machine, blindly producing some behavior. Yeah. So that thing is going to the very definition of what cognitive science is.
It does, I think. That's correct. So, of course, as you know very well, that this is a super fraught question in the history of cognitive science. Right? So there is, if you think of it in terms of two broad camps, there is in some sense, the side which emphasizes just the behavior, which includes Turing himself, Zenon Pilishin, and many other people, right? For whom, if it does stuff which could be to us as intelligent stuff, then it must be doing intelligent stuff, right? Now it seems to me that that's it doesn't say enough. I think it's a little reductionist, right? Because, and that's why I think, and I love this question because this is exactly the kind of discussion I want it to lead towards, because art here is really kind of a takeoff point to this larger questions about the capacities of AI and that kind of stuff, right? So I think it seems to me that we should be saying something more about the stuff that we see something produce. Then just say, oh yeah, that I can read meaning into it. That means it must be meaningful. Now I can certainly read meaning into whatever AI produces, because I clearly have those capacities of speaking, right? But it seems to me that if I want to meaningfully distinguish say a chimpanzee making something versus ChatGPT making something, I have to say something about the inner configuration of the chimpanzees versus ChatGPT. Somehow. Now obviously, the behavior has to be a guide. What I say in cognitive science, you cannot ignore the behavior. The behavior has to be important. It has to be a guide. But it seems to me that you need to advance some theoretical or explanatory point or explanatory standards based upon the behavior. Based upon the behavior that you observe, based upon what you observe, right? And that is what will allow us to meaningfully make a distinction between different cognitive entities, because there's so many different entities of different layers of complexity. And I think that what chimpanzees do is interesting in ways which ChatGPT can't manage, or vice versa. Right? So I think there has to be something about the internal configuration of the entity that's producing this work. It cannot just be the output. It cannot just be the...
It will also depend upon the reader. I mean, you made some gesture or you uttered some sound. Utterly, maybe you meant something very different from what the reader is reading.
Sure.
So meaning is not something fixed.
Of course not. Yes. Of course not.
Okay, there's a student there. Yes. Yes, please.
Hello. So I'm not from the Department of Philosophy. I'm from the Department of English. So my question might not be related on the philosophical plane, but trust me, it's related to this.
Sure.
So taking it from the inception of the talk, you talked about the Colorado Art Fair and talked about Jason Allen and how he won the prize there. So do you think that the art made by generative AI supersede art galleries or the art museums? And also, one more question to it is, Benjamin in his work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction talks about a social hierarchy. So does it going to change the way we look at art and the artists in some form when we are looking at the generative created art that we are talking about in today's time?
That's interesting. So first question, I'm not sure what you mean by like supersedes art made in the gallery or kept in the galleries. I'm not sure why it would supersede or why. I mean, it depends on the art itself, right?
Okay.
So it seems to be conceptually possible that some AI art could supersede some art in galleries. Of course, but there's no general rule obviously. So yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe you should like tell me more about the question because I don't think I got that. The second part on Benjamin, I think it's clearly going to be political and sociological dimensions, undisputed. Benjamin obviously was interested in a certain type of dimension. I didn't get much into because for me the important thing for this talk about Benjamin is the mechanical reproducibility. Now, of course, Benjamin has a lot of other things to say about aura and cultural product. And he thinks that in the absence of aura or iconicity of the artwork, art becomes just political. That's what Benjamin thinks, right? He thinks it just becomes subordinate to political ends. Now, yeah, I'm not sure. I think that's a bit of a reductionist view. So I don't agree with Benjamin on that. I don't think it necessarily becomes subordinate only to politics. But Benjamin is obviously writing in the context of '30s Germany, and he's a kind of Frankfurt school type of person. So for him, the most important, it's always about, for any thinker, what their project is, right? So for Benjamin, the project was to understand the propaganda art of the Nazis and so on and so forth. So for him, the political concern was very important, that makes sense. But as we saw in the history of art, even when we lost the aura, even when we have mechanical reproducibility, so art loses quote-unquote the aura in some sense, or the aura at least diminishes. It does not mean that interesting artistic developments came to art. That's why I went to Warhol and all those things. Art kept growing. It turned conceptual. So it seems to me that Benjamin was actually wrong about that. I think he was not right about it being just subordinate to politics.
Okay.
Shikha?
Thank you.
So that, yes.
We can follow up later as well.
So my question is more like comments on various things that have been discussed and sort of brought up. One is from the perspective of art itself. So, for instance, when we are looking at this whole question of whether AI can be even considered as an artist in itself, right? And the precedent that we're facing in some ways is intentionality, right? But when we're looking at a work of art and suppose we don't know who the artist is, so the artist, so to speak, leaves it blank, saying up to you for your own interpretation, right? We're encountering the work of art for its own sake and then making meaning out of it, right? That somewhere connects to Naveed's question as well, because this larger question of meaning making. And then, I mean, I was also thinking something that sort of just struck me. There was an incident, this could also come up with regards to this whole idea of whether an artwork is successful or not. There was a 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝗃 painting, which was sold for $1.4 million, and it's shredded with $25.4 million. Now, we may not necessarily think of it as an artist. Yeah, it was, but nonetheless, we may not necessarily think of it as an artistic supplementation to its value, but it definitely indicates some degree of success, right? Whatever kind it may be. And now that sort of connects also to this whole idea of the socio-political place of the work of art, because even with someone like Duchamp, you know, one part of placing an object such as that urinal was to critique the larger commercial framework within it. So what I'm really trying to say, and these are all questions related to the art part of it. Right? Now the other bit, which is in terms of artificial intelligence, so to speak, even if we look at the skills that are required in creating prompts for producing a particular piece of art, is it the same sort of skill that a person holding a paintbrush who actually does? So exactly. So shouldn't there be some sort of a distinction between the two? Because this is a prevalent practice even within photography, that unfiltered pictures or pictures that have not been processed or pictures that have been processed with film are appreciated at different levels in different ways. So I do think there has to be some sort of a understanding of the kind of skill required as well within each, even if you do consider it art.
Right. So those are great questions, and I think the stuff that I am saying and I believe is pretty much consistent with the stuff that I'm saying. So let's start in reverse order. So the last question. I think that's absolutely true, that different types of skill have different types of value and appreciation, and that's definitely true. So, for example, if you write for one of the higher quality magazines, right, instead of publishing your photograph as the author, they'll often publish a nice sketch of yours, right? And that could say nice. So, if you publish in the Little magazine or the New York Book or whatever, one of those nice places, then it's instead of photograph, you have a sketch, right? And the photograph is easily got, it is exact reproduction of what they look like. And the sketch is obviously not as easily got, it's not an exact reproduction, but that's what makes it interesting, because it allows the artist to say something about how they see it, how they want to present it, right? So that's certainly true. I think the really main thing which kind of addresses or responds to the worries and concerns that you have is very much this distinction between the philosophy of art and aesthetics in some sense, right? So the philosophy of art takes as its question the idea of what art might even be, for example. Now, how can we put things in this bucket called art? How can we categorize it as art, right? That's one kind of inquiry. Aesthetic inquiry is a different type of inquiry. That's about stuff like, is that the kind of skill I want to promote or sponsor? Is that pretty? Is that useful? Is that politically right or whatever? Is that sociologically important or unimportant? So those are all very super important questions, nationally. But they're distinct from the question that Danto takes himself to be answering. And that is an example of this thing called the philosophy of art. Right? So the historical thing or the traditional division, of course, is aesthetics. But what we have in the 20th century, especially, with conceptual art coming up, with art becoming more and more like meaning making, right? That's kind of historical development, that's how I was laying out some of those things, is this inauguration almost of this idea of the philosophy of art, which is distinct in some sense. Of course, related to, but distinct from aesthetics, right? So, a lot of things that you're talking about, and she was talking about, and I find very important, are aesthetic considerations, which of course, I think in any avant-garde sense would include the politics, right? That's quite important to aesthetics. I'm not a classicist or traditionalist, but I would say that aesthetic words are different from the political. I think they're implicated with each other, right? But that's different from this question of whether it's artistic at all, right? And I think that when we're talking about like what AI is able to do and that kind of stuff, because here we're talking, this connects to Naveen's question, right? Here we're talking about what this new entity is managing to produce, right? So before we can, I think, meaningfully weigh upon all those aesthetic questions, I think we need some conceptual clarity also on in which conditions can we say that it's making it. So that's what I'm trying to do here at least in this talk. Kind of clearing some sense of prior ground.
And you know, so trying to set a baseline. Okay, since it does this, we can consider it after. Whether we're not going to consider whether it's good or not.
It is very important. Only that it's I think it's super important actually. So for my cards on the table, I think this Jason Allen thing is super mediocre. This stuff that I just showed you, I think it's really, really mediocre. Right? It looks like a mediocre video game, I think, to me. Now that's my cards on the table. Now obviously aesthetic judgments and all, also there is fairly high degree of objectivity and all those kind of things. So there's this kind of discussion there, right? But it seems that the prior discussion of, is that artistic? And under what conditions is it artistic? That seems to be less amenable to subjectivity of the sort. Although of course there's going to be variations on that. Of course there's going to be difference of opinion on that. But a little less subjective, I would say. Then, I mean, I'm sure that people would say, this is amazing. That's why they won that prize, right?
No, I mean, so yeah, it's pretty, but I'm also thinking in terms of its artistic or conceptual value. I mean, even compare it to something like Rousseau. Conceptually,
very important.
I'm really trying to understand what is the conceptual upshot of that picture from Jason Allen.
What he's trying to, that's a good question. What he's trying to show is the very fact that he could make this, because he spoke about this, without having to exercise the skill. And that's pretty interesting. That actually connects to all kinds of important discussions. So it connects, for example, to discussion in the philosophy of disability. It's like, what's the connection between, and I was kind of making that point because let me say, I'm disabled at making cartoons, in a sense. But I can now make these cartoons with this tool. That's interesting.
But, so my first question was, I wanted to understand that this Colorado art competition, was this...
I understand you jumped the queue, but it's okay.
Sorry.
It's a kind of follow-up.
That's okay. No, because others are responding, so addressing that.
So contemplative, because was this judged on the contemplation, on the reflection, on the idea, or the skill, or both?
So that's a very good question. So I think that's actually great, because I think people assume initially that it was judged on the skill. That's why they were outraged that why did this win against human artists who have demonstrated much more skill and so on and so forth. But then the judges, I think, end up clarifying, because they double down and say we'll still give it the prize. Because the judges then are, it seems to me at least suggesting that we are judging it on the newness, on the conceptual point being made, not merely the skill. Right?
And now I want to answer the disability part of things, because you know, I kind of interact with visual art and I see myself and where do I place myself, whether it can be described also, you know, all sorts of questions, there are many questions. So, but answering, so you just said that, you know, I'm able, like I can produce a visual art.
I didn't say I'm able to. I didn't use that word.
Good that you did not.
I didn't. I said I was disabled about making, but I didn't say that I'm able.
Okay, but that's a different discussion we will talk about this later. But yeah, at the same time, what I'm saying is that it also depends on the interaction. For example, if I'm not able to if I'm not able to see what I'm producing, or what I would want to produce, whether it is taking the correct prompts also. I don't think that. So I wanted to keep my question for the later time, but now I'm sort of budging in and coming to because that is also a follow-up question. That when you say that I'm an artist or so and so is an artist, one is the skill, then is the contemplation. Okay, so this is on the performer's part. And the other thing is the interpretation of the audience, of the seer. Okay? So that means there are two interactions happening. One is the artist interacting with the art itself, with their art, and the other is the art, the audience interacting with the art. And there is another layer that the audience through that art interacting with the artist.
That's right.
So all of these
Yes.
themes,
Yes.
whether they are getting fulfilled or
Yes.
not.
Yeah.
So because we are getting to the axioms, to the primary premises.
Yeah.
So to me it sounds very obvious that it is not a piece of art.
Which part is not piece of art?
Like, I mean, artificial intelligence cannot be an artist.
It's that, right? But what about somebody using it to create art? Those are two different things.
So he is a good prompter.
So that, why is it not on? Why is it not on?
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. Because skill plus interaction plus performance plus an interaction with the audience, all of that becomes a conversation, and that is meaning. Meaning is not on the part of that piece of art or audience themselves standing alone and the artist standing alone. I think all of it seen together becomes art.
Yeah, but that's all there, right, in this case. How does that happen?
How?
So is that, are you done with the question or?
Yes. Okay. Maybe I'm missing a link, so you fill it in.
Yeah, okay, so a couple of things. I was trying to say something earlier in response to Shweta and Naveen as well. So I'll first just finish that, and because it's directly linked to this, and then come to this, right? When I was going with the disability point was a larger point, which is what something we have discussed with Wilson earlier on, that it's important about the whole domain of practical knowledge, the knowledge how, right? So in the knowledge how literature, Jason Stanley and Tim Williamson have this, I think, incredibly excellent example. So they're talking about a pianist, okay? And this guy is an expert pianist. And as it so happens, he goes to war and he loses arms, right? And then he comes back. And the question then is, does he know how to play the piano? Now obviously he cannot demonstrate the skill anymore because he doesn't have arms, right? And let us imagine that he cannot get prosthetics or whatever. So he cannot demonstrate the skill, he cannot do the output, the behavioristic stuff, the behavior, right? He can't do that anymore. It seems to me, and Stanley and Williamson say the same thing, and I agree with that he clearly still knows how to play the piano, even though he can't demonstrate. Right? Because he was, before he lost his arms, unfortunately, an excellent pianist. So he still has that capacity in some sense, even though he can't demonstrate the capacity. Right? So that's just response to some of the stuff that was going on earlier. That we demonstrate our capacities in various modalities. And that's very important. That again is this gap, and that's something which cognitive science really gets subsumed into. The distinction between the capacities that we have and the ways we show them in the world. Right? So I have the capacity for human language. The only way I show it is not by speaking, right? I use it for all kinds of things. Right? And you do that with all the intellectual capacities that you have. Similarly with the case of art. So Jason certainly has the capacity to make art. He's an artist, he makes a living being an artist. Right? Now he chooses in this instance to demonstrate that capacity using Midjourney. That's one thing that's going on, right? That's why when we're talking in cognitive science, we cannot talk only of the behavior. Because that is a very imperfect guide. The guy who doesn't have the arms anymore cannot play the piano, but he still knows how to play the piano. He can teach the piano. Right? But hang on, please.
I want to request that there is too many people waiting with their questions.
Right.
I would request everybody to, in the first round, just have one question. And of course, I fully agree that we are on a Friday evening, and Friday evening no time restrictions apply. Yeah. So please be patient. Everybody will get a chance. But in the first round, only one question from one person, right? Because there are a lot of people who have come to attend from different departments, they should not feel left out. Okay, yeah.
Right. So, I was just responding to Savita for you.
Yeah, okay, fine.
We'll get to that later.
Okay.
Yeah. But please remember.
It's in my mind.
Yeah, please.
No, I didn't respond. I'm just going to expand it later, maybe. Yeah. I did respond. In this case, I think all that social art meaning making is happening.
So I'm not talking about this case. So then we will talk about it.
Yeah,
I'm saying AI and art in general.
Okay.
Not specifically.
Okay.
But I would want to talk about your earlier example that you replied to.
Yeah, definitely.
That's good.
I'll make it really short, but I do have two questions.
Yeah,
First of all, I'd like to thank you because as a scholar who's interested in aesthetics and philosophy of art, this was very engaging and a very important talk. Thank you. So since probably because I have a problem with dichotomous categories personally, so I'd like to question on the two categories you've mentioned. One is aesthetic qualities versus artistic qualities, and one is the last one, the one that you concluded with. AI as a tool versus AI as an artist.
The versus is just kind of demonstrative.
No, I understand that. No, I'm not questioning that. I was just wanting to say that we can. It's possible that we can make that distinction of aesthetic and artistic qualities, but then when we consider aesthetic experience and then aesthetic contemplation, that becomes one and the same thing. I mean, there cannot be a distinction in what will be the aesthetic experience of it or what will be the aesthetic contemplation of it.
But I never said we're talking about aesthetic contemplation, I said we're talking about artistic contemplation.
Yes.
Okay, just contemplation in general.
But in human endeavor, you cannot really, I feel like you cannot make a real distinction between when you contemplate over what is artistic and what is aesthetic. So,
I think I can make a distinction between if I see like one of Picasso's paintings which are meant to be very beautiful. Let us say his portraits of his father, made with charcoal, right? And it was a kind of facsimile reproduction, right? And it's pretty stunning, especially for a 14-year-old to do that. I think it seems to me, I can kind of meaningfully distinguish between the stance I have towards that versus Guernica. Because it would be a little weird, I would say personally, that if I had the same feeling of looking at those beautiful portraits versus looking at this painting which talks about it's about war, people losing their limbs and so on and so forth. So it seems that I should have appropriately different emotional response.
So actually basically what I got from it is that aesthetics is probably something superlative and philosophy is a part of that artistic expression that we can gauge and we can theorize upon.
No, nobody's saying that, so that's just...
That's another thing?
Walk away with that feeling.
Okay.
Of course, aesthetics is obviously not this.
That is just, I think probably that's something I'd like to read more upon so that I can have a better understanding of.
Yeah, nobody's dismissing aesthetics, of course.
Of course.
Yeah.
And then...
I had a question.
No, Nilanjan now. After this.
And so
You are in the queue. You can.
the more important question I had was that AI as a tool versus AI as an artist. I understand that AI cannot be branded as an artist so far.
At least currently, yeah.
Yeah, so far, yes. But the thing is that no tool in human history ever has been able to help the artist as much as AI is being able to. A paintbrush could not, harmonium could not, a piano, a synth could not. But
I would say, hang on, I would say
so the co-creation part or the assisting or the assistance of a tool.
Hang on. I think what cameras do, modern cameras and what synthesizers do is, I think more than what AI is like. So I think it's an open question.
It is an open question.
Music production does this.
But then...
Music production
That's what I'm saying. Synthesizers do a lot there. So it's an empirical question. You can't just so...
Yeah, please see. Second round. Yeah, Suresh. Yeah.
So when Andy Warhol tries to make the pillow boxes and then Danto vouches for him that is an art by saying that it's not completely just by saying that his idea of art was not understood in the institutional post-structuralist way. And say there is something essentially artistic about Andy Warhol.
Yes.
So in a sense that can be read as Danto vouching for the people who are actually behind making the first person who made the Brillo artwork firstly. He was a graphic designer working in a company.
Yeah, right.
And that was the person who was making the art for the first time, and it was completely as a vocation he was doing it, right? His vocation was to be the graphic designer, and surely there was some expressive element to it also, definitely.
Sure, yeah.
So, how would Danto look at AI today, which in a sense reduces, first of all, some of the agency of the artist making the art, putting all of his intention, and the second very just simple question, it just takes a lot of vocation out there, which is again people who are artists as professionals, it takes their jobs out, and that is in line with what Benjamin tried to show in the mechanical production also, right? So, and your view on philosophy and poetry, and how philosophy can also create that sort of contemplation on the side of the reader, which can be considered aesthetic and artistic, right? So,
I don't know. I mean, I wish the most of the philosophy I happen to read is super prosaic. It's rare where it, in fact, so Plato, of course, is a great example of philosophy which is quite beautiful in terms of how it's expressed. But it's very, of course, yeah, so there are some great examples, but then unfortunately, most of them are very boring.
So Danto is vouching for the vocation also, but then he's also taking the essentialist view of it having like art always being one thing, but then by going against it being dependent on social conditions, and the subjectivity itself is always conditioned. What one finds interesting is always conditioned.
I would suggest you in a kind of friendly way to focus on the like one question at a time, because there's so many important, interesting discussions happening here. So on this issue about the graphic design thing, I think that's actually quite important and interesting. So Danto clearly did not think that just design by itself is art. He didn't think that, honestly, because he has that art world condition there, right? So design, once presented artistically in some sense, is art. The video boxes or candle soup cans or whatever, right? But just the design, which is obviously design has its own functional utility. It's supposed to make the product attractive on the store shelf, stand out from competing products, amenable to advertising, whatever. There are all kinds of other very important things and interesting things it does. It's not art, for Danto at least, right? And there is dispute in the literature on that. There's a lot, in fact, currently there's a huge and I think very interesting literature on the aesthetics of everyday objects. So 𝗵𝗶𝗁𝗵𝗁 has this recent, Japanese philosopher, recent book on that, very interesting. And I think there's much to be said about the aesthetics of everyday objects and how when that is lost, we have much poorer lives. When we have lives which are characterized only by functionality everywhere around us, it's pretty bad, And you see that difference, like living in the US as I have been for the past few years, it's pretty shocking actually, I think the difference. You see American films of the 70s, and you see houses and hotels and all that are depicted. There are even cars on the road, the wallpapers that people have, etc. There was a lot of artistic intent and aesthetic intent there. America was not this super ridiculously functional country that it is now. Now you have, due to lots of complicated factors, including these extremely restrictive building codes and those kind of things, it's hard to create artistic buildings in the South there right now, and there's a larger discussion. And it's just, functionality has taken over to such an extent of functionalism that you have these plain pastels, walls and all that kind of, and I think it's, a lot is lost in life by that kind of stuff, right? So what I'm saying with all of this is that, again in kind of response to what she was saying earlier as well, nobody is saying that the aesthetic is really important, right? The fact that the video boxes are made in the way they are, very striking, etc., is very important. And perhaps that plays some role in, although I can't peek into Warhol's mind, obviously, maybe that played some role in Warhol presenting them in that manner, right? What we're talking about is a distinction. And I think what some people here are missing is distinctions are not automatically normative. They're not normatively loaded. So when you say, oh, this is aesthetic object, but it may not be validly a work of art. It's not the same thing to say, oh, that means it has less utility or less value than a work of art. That's a further claim. Nobody's making that. So it's very important, especially in the business that we are all in, which is philosophy. In this trade, all that we can really do is deploy fine-grained distinctions. Right? What we do is in a hopeful vein, of course, try to clarify things conceptually, right? So that people can understand in some sense things better, right? Which is why it's quite important to distinguish, to discern, and so on and so forth, right? And to be guarded, I think, against quick normative judgment. I think that's a normative claim is a thick and important way. So that would be my kind of general methodological urge, to everybody.
This question here. Yeah, Sumesh, yeah. Nice presentation and interesting discussion. Someone want to make about the cyclical point that you talked about. Right. You were saying that cognitive science was basically talking about the way in which we characterize aspect of aesthetic behavior, right? So, but now cognitive science was actually talking about these points. It was clear to everyone that there are certain questions about facts, and there are certain questions about things things that matters of decision, right? So whether an object is an art object, it's a question that deals with the matters of decision.
Mm-hmm.
So every cognitive science who is serious about his task is very clear about this distinction. Nobody was worried about the question that whether something is an art object as created by a machine. So Turing, for example, in the 1950s, asking the question, can machine think? And it is clear that what is the right kind of approach. And no cognitive science is worried about that question, because it's clear that machine cannot think. And if that is the case, then machine cannot make art. And Turing made this point that it is too meaningless to deserve a discussion.
Yes.
So the point is that there is a conceptually clear point that you need to make, that whether if an object is created by a machine, we don't ascribe intentionality to that. And so it's clear that this kind of discussion is depending upon the decision that you make. There is no fact of the matter which suggests you that you can provide an answer to that question. Chomsky again, talking about the same point, saying that if you are creating a submarine and pulling people into believing that this is a wave, and then you can't ask the question that whether submarines swim or aeroplanes fly, or you create a robot and you can ask the question whether
Do you have a question?
It lifts weight. So there is a conceptual distinction between facts and decision. So the topic that we talk about is basically about decision, not about facts.
So I'm still not sure about I guess I take it as a comment on the larger proceedings, so to speak. But the question there, if it was there, I couldn't see it. What's the question?
You talk about the last point, the philosophical kind of issue that we make. In philosophy, there are two kinds of questions. One is the question that deals with facts.
Philosophy doesn't deal with questions of fact.
Other is the question
It's the special sciences which deal with questions of fact. When philosophy doesn't deal with questions.
So, can't talk about this one. There is two kinds of problem. One is de facto, other is de jure. Carnap talk about the same thing. Popper talk about that same thing. Chomsky again I mentioned the same point, that there are certain issues that deal with facts. If you are developing a theory and if you are not providing facts, anyone can give any kind of answer to that kind of issues. So that is that if you look at the response that people are raising, because of that kind of thing, there is subjective element that much involved in this kind of thing.
So hang on, I got it. Two couple of things there. So the basic thing here is, and I don't think there's any real dispute to that, is that we decide how in whatever domain, whether it's normative or other domains or whatever, or speculative domains or whatever, we decide based upon some facts, assume, right? If you have to something upon which we decide, right? Yeah, so to that extent, facts enter the picture, hang on. But philosophy inherently, by its very nature, it seems to me, is about things on which questions of fact are not fully settled. Once questions of fact are settled, it stops being a philosophical question, right? It passes off onto the sciences, social sciences, or any other thing, right? So philosophy is inherently, there is a speculative element. There's an element of uncertainty to some extent. Two philosophical questions. That seems to be the basics of what a philosophical question is, right? And that seems entirely consistent with everybody from 𝗏𝗏𝗄𝗏, or anybody who does cloud series. So I'm again not super sure about what the exact question is.
The point is that everyone who is working on this kind of stuff, they were clear that this distinction can be made, and they were not worried about this question that can machine think, even though.
Have you read the last part of Turing's essay where he responds to 9 objections?
Yeah, I have read it.
So who's responding?
He raised 6 questions.
There are 9 objections.
Yeah, first one.
Responds to 9 of them, and those are about this question of whether his interpretation.
Yeah, so the first part in the objection, he says that this question, I know, I'm just quoting Turing, because it is too meaningless to deserve.
Yeah. So wait, we can carry on. You can carry on this longer discussion because there are many people who are waiting for an answer. Yes, there's one here first. Yeah.
So, sir, I want to pull back to the term of generative, because generative, implicates generative of what, generative in what domain. For example, don't you think when we talk about intentionality, aboutness, as Danto has selected the criteria, the meaning can be given, the meaning of art has an element of spontaneity. For example, when Valmiki saw these 2 birds got killed, and he was in the state of sorrow, prejudice, lived experience, facticity, the suffering, and then the poetic phrases came. So, I'm the great artist. Right now, I have to create something. So, unlike the AI, which will go about billions of images and then generate something out of it, but me as an artist, situated in a certain ethnocentric situation, in certain spatial dimension, would give an element of spontaneity that AI won't give. For example, those paintings were very Eurocentric. And second point is that I think it might be far-fetched, I think it might be controversial, but the same reason that trans women were banned from beauty pageants, I think the one difference was the lived experience as a biological woman. So whether we accept it or deny it, this is the reason, and this same criterion can be imported to this Danto's criterion.
Yeah. So both the questions are interesting, raise interesting issues. The first actually connects to Turing's essay, the 9 objections. One of them, perhaps the most important, is Ada Lovelace's objection there to Turing's interpretation or description of artificial thinking or machine thinking, which is that AI lacks spontaneity, even inclusive. That's the objection that Lovelace has there. Now, there's actually a big discussion in cognitive science and AI on this stuff, because it's been going on since Turing at least. Now, the thing is that with generative AI, one of the interesting things, and this is touched upon what we were discussing in the beginning, there is a certain opacity to the algorithms, which did not exist with earlier forms, right? So, even the programmer with deep learning mechanisms cannot say with full certainty how the output is being produced, right? So, it's an open question on a philosophical speculation on whether there is spontaneity there or not. It's a difficult issue.
Can I correct it further? Pull it further. Just one point. Just single point. The criteria of empathy that we partake in the story of Vincent van Gogh, that he cut off his ear.
If you just some patience, listen to because you have identified very excellent issues on a serious way. So I'm just kind of trying to respond to that. So one is this spontaneity issue. I'm kind of saying that the issues you have identified have been age-old and remain relevant on this discussion. The empathy or emotions issue is very crucial. In fact, it leads to this larger issue you were talking about earlier, which is organicity. So that's at the back of Searle's objection. When Searle's talking about the Chinese rule, what he's concerned about is that it's not organic matter that produces those symbols. It's computation. And he thinks that even in principle, no matter the computational complexity, it will never have emotion. it will never have that kind of organic reaction. And it thinks that we cannot talk about thinking without it. So these are very crucial issues that you are raising. I'm just saying that those issues exist in the literature. There is a very fine discussion already on that. Like the Searle essay was published it was a lead essay in PBS in 1980, Behavioral Sciences. And then that's the PBS format. There are commentaries on that by lots of researchers in the field, right? Everybody from 𝗁𝗍𝗶𝗵 to Roger Schank to Hofstadter and lots of other luminaries respond to Searle. Some are in agreement, some are deeply in disagreement, etc. And I send that to my Ashoka class every year, these commentaries. And the interesting thing is that I think very much the distinction that they are making there, the points that they are saying, pretty much applies to discussions on generative AI. Right? So there's a lot of applicability to these questions that you are raising to these current discussions. Right? If you read that stuff, you become much better equipped to take this critical yet charitable stance to developments in generative AI. So all the points you are raising are actually basically in agreement with the points that you are saying. And there's a lot that goes on to thinking. That's why I was talking about consciousness, intentionality, agency. There are probably other things as well, because those are just necessary conditions, not sufficient conditions, right? Which goes on to saying that you have thinking, which seems necessary for actually autonomously producing works of art. So it's not just making something in some mechanical way and presenting it, but a lot of what goes processing that happens before that. That's the capacity stuff. Right? So you have those capacities behind you in certain sense, like abstract, and then those are demonstrated in various ways. And because we have those capacities all the time, we take them for granted. Right? This is a big bane of initial cognitive science, anthropomorphizing things constantly. Right? So you see an animal making something, or you see AI making something, and humans almost impulsively jump to saying, oh, that's just like human art. And that's why the transcendental argument was important. That X exists only if Y exists. So it would be something like human art, or something meaningfully similar to it, if some of the similar capacities are acting in a manner. That's the kind of point that Searle is making, and I think it's an important point.
Sandra? Yeah, she's here. Yeah, Sandra.
So I would like to ask you about intentionality of art. So Danto says that intentionality is a criteria, and if that fulfills, we can call something an art.
It's one of the criteria.
Yeah, and then the other one is artward and symbolic. So talking about intentionality, it being about something, meaning of something, or something that I act upon has to have an intention. Is that all? Because I might lack the motor skill to perform an art, create an art.
Yeah, that's like a piano player example.
Yeah. And then there is also an intentionality towards that motor skill. So to say that intentionality is all is...
Intentionality simply, it has nothing to do with intention, it simply means meaning.
Yeah.
Intentionality is a philosophical, it's a kind of technical term. All it means is the ability to make meaning. Intentions are a different discussion.
Okay. Okay, I think this is all.
Yeah, because that's lots of action. It's a different discussion of it.
Yeah, yes. Yeah. Yes.
So as you have taken up the example of Plato's theory of copy theory, right, in your presentation, Plato's copy theory.
Yeah, I just touched upon it.
Yeah. So my question is can we might think that Plato's theory of form and concept of AI generating diverse outputs in terms of interactions with the evolving debate on the subjectivity and subjectivity of aesthetics, experience, and the contemporary philosophy.
I don't think I get the question.
So, just taking up the theory of copy theory of Plato in your mind. So, and bring it the AI in its connection, and just put it up the question that can we might think that Plato's theory of form and the concept of AI generating diverse outputs, interactions with the evolving debate on the subjectivity of aesthetics, experience,
in contemporary philosophy?
So there is a big difference there, right? Plato's closest form is not generative. The forms are supposed to be exhaustive, right? Which means that the soul has already in the world of forms seen all the forms, or whatever, experience or whatever, so in some sense acquainted with the forms, right? And then through analysis or recollection, when it's in a living being or something, has some faint memory or recollection of those forms. So that's Plato, and it's quite profound, of course. It's important for all kinds of things, but it's not generative in the sense of what we're talking about here, right? In cognitive science. Because generative means that you take some symbols, some small set of entities, and you can combine them, usually infinite or unbounded ways, to create new forms. That's generative. It's a technical word, right? That's what generative means. So it's like the natural numbers are generated set, right? In the sense that you just have 10 natural numbers initially, right? Just 30. And then you can combine them using some very simple rules. Yeah, those axioms. And you suddenly have the whole number line, right? So that's generative, or language is generative. That is some basic alphabets or consonants, sounds, and you combine them. Like infinity, discrete infinity, right? So generative is a pretty recent idea in the history of ideas. It requires a lot of development in mathematics, what's called recursion, before you have generative theory. That's why modern cognitive science is a very 20th century phenomenon. So there are Platonic influences in a big way on things like innate ideas and all. There's Platonic influence, but not on the generative. So don't mix that.
Dr. 𝗏𝗏.
Yeah, just some loud thinking. I was thinking that if we look at art as, evolving and dynamic and not static, and which obviously any discourse is, and so there was art as portraiture, there is art as still life. Absolutely. And when I look at still life, I certainly think that at one level, it's a rehabilitation of the everyday, the mundane. Yeah. So you can put a jug there or flower vase and paint it. Right. And so it is being endowed with a certain meaning.
Correct.
Okay, and then you talked about art becoming conceptual. So for me, Guernica is a very high form of art form. So obviously, it also has to do with the larger question about the artist not being, dealing with esoteric meaning, but somewhere owing responsibility to society at large. That it must interject, it must bring to public consciousness what is not being. Right. So it also acts as a highlighter.
Right.
So just thinking loud that, could you look at AI also, art also subsuming this movement?
Yeah, that's interesting.
That this is a movement, of course, there is got to be a hierarchy in the artist's mind that this is not art, certainly lacks spontaneity and all that. But I think that at one level you could also just pass it off, because as you talked about the prompt being given, the capacity of the prompter.
Right.
That's it.
That's actually great. So the historicalness is critical, I think, and that's very much why I like Danto's theory, because it is a historical theory. That's why the art world condition exists. And so I didn't go into a lot of detail on that stuff, but he has lots of lovely examples in that. So it's like one of the examples about a bicycle sprocket. Right, so like if you find or if you put a bicycle sprocket in a context other than any modern context, the object doesn't have meaning. It only has meaning in the context of where bicycles exist, for example, that kind of stuff. Right? So art, the art world in some sense, obviously develops upon stuff that has gone on before. And eventually it has reached a state, and where he thinks it becomes like philosophy. Of course, metaphorical power which philosophy does not have, so it's expressive in a different way. But it has reached that state where the sheer physicality of the object in certain sense is not what is providing it the artistic essence or artistic power. That's the identity of indiscernibles thing which is important, right? So and that's why it's conceptual or abstract. So it's a very historical account. what you're saying after that, I think that's quite interesting, I think actually, which is that the AI epoch, so to speak, is part of that ongoing history. I think that's clearly right, it seems to me. But my question or my investigation here would be, where is it or what is it in that history? Now it's obviously, it seems to me that AI as something we can use to generate art is certainly really important. And I like that fact that it is then providing expressive power to so many people who may not have generated art before. And that's kind of history and that's technological development. So it's like in filmmaking, for example, Mrinal Sen had once said, and it was pretty great, that filmmaking would become a people's art form when camera and film would become as cheap as pen and paper. And something very deep about that, I think. And we have that now pretty much. Almost a reality because everybody has camera phones. So the class of potential artists is much bigger. And I think if AI keeps developing in the right direction, because it's a very cutting edge technology, so we don't quite know where things head. But if it keeps progressing, it seems it provides expressive power to so many people who are not doing art already. So I think that's the historical sense in which it is very, very important.
Okay, I was a little uneasy when you gave that child's example. Sorry, I didn't see it. I'll come to you. Yeah. When you give the child's example, you can take a seat, I think you're right.
Yeah, I'll just actually need a little bit more water.
Yeah, please can somebody take some water from your office? Yeah, when you give the child's example, I'm a bit uneasy with that judgment. And I thought that maybe the judgment was a bit uncharitable towards the child. For the simple reason that the expression part you grant, the first one, Danto's one condition, you are saying the child is satisfying. And you disqualify the child only on the art world thing. But I would say that how do we know that the child has not been exposed to enough so-called the art world? The fact that we have not had very intense, penetrative, you can say, interrogation or you can say interaction with the child. So child cannot say how the child has looked at things. And also given the preponderance of magic, the way children relate to things magically, I think there is maybe they have not articulated the art world, or we are having a very restrictive adult art.
Oh yeah, that's definitely possible, I think. So that's a very good point. I would read myself, I would interpret Danto there as in a very thank you, thanks so much. I would interpret it as something as a framework is providing of analysis. I wouldn't necessarily, in many cases, endorse the result, much in your spirit. I would say that the framework of analysis is interesting. That if these conditions are met, it's not just doing something aesthetic, but actually making something artistic in some sense. But I think you're right, and okay, that's another thing where I would depart from Danto a little bit. It seems to me that the art world can be much larger in some sense than a traditional subject. So when one talks about the art world, I think even a little bit of acquaintance with the art world can be enough to relate you to the history of art. Obviously, you don't need a lot of acquaintance, right? So suppose you saw like a couple of films or something, and in seeing a couple of films, you were moved by certain things.